The autumn morning at Windsor Castle felt different somehow. 8-year-old Prince George walked slowly through the long corridors, his small footsteps echoing against the ancient stone walls. Something was troubling him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. For the past few weeks, George had noticed that Officer Matthews, one of his favorite guards, seemed sad. The tall man with kind brown eyes always used to smile and wave at George when he passed by during his rounds. But lately, Matthews barely looked up from his duties. George remembered the day when Matthews first started working at the castle. The guard had been nervous, dropping his radio twice during his first week. George had seen it happen and had quietly picked up the radio, handing it back with a reassuring smile. From that moment, a special friendship had grown between the young prince and the dedicated guard. Matthews was different from the other guards. While most of them maintained a strict professional distance, Matthews had a warmth that reminded George of his grandfather. He would sometimes share interesting facts about the castle's history when they crossed paths in the empty hallways. He told George about the secret passages, the ghosts that supposedly roamed the towers, and the brave knights who once protected these walls. But now, Matthews looked tired all the time. His uniform, usually perfectly pressed, seemed wrinkled. His shoulders sagged, as if carrying an invisible weight. George had overheard some adults talking in hushed voices about budget cuts and staff reductions, but he didn't understand what that meant for someone like Matthews. One particularly gray morning, George was returning from his private tutoring session when he saw Matthews standing alone in the East Wing corridor. The guard was staring out of one of the tall windows, his reflection looking ghostly in the glass. George could see that Matthews was holding an envelope in his hands, turning it over and over as if he couldn't decide what to do with it. George approached quietly, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Good morning, Officer Matthews," he said softly, not wanting to startle the man. Matthews turned quickly, trying to hide the envelope behind his back, but George had already seen it. And more importantly, he had seen the sadness in Matthews' eyes. "Your Royal Highness," Matthews said, attempting his usual respectful tone, but his voice cracked slightly. "Are you all right?" George asked, tilting his head to one side the way children do when they're genuinely concerned. "You seem upset about something." Matthews looked down at the young prince, torn between maintaining his professional boundaries and responding to the sincere worry he saw in George's face. "I'm fine, Your Highness. Just thinking about some things." But George was perceptive for his age. He had learned to read people's emotions by watching his parents handle countless diplomatic situations. He could tell when someone was putting on a brave face, and Matthews was definitely not fine. "Is it about the letter?" George asked gently, nodding toward the envelope that Matthews was still trying to hide. Matthews sighed, realizing there was no point in pretending anymore. This young prince had always been observant and caring. "It's my resignation letter," he admitted quietly. "I've been carrying it around for 3 days, trying to find the courage to submit it." George's heart sank. He had suspected something like this might be happening. But why? "Don't you like working here anymore?" The question hit Matthews harder than any formal inquiry from his superiors could have. "Oh, Your Highness, I love working here. This place, these people, you and your family. You've become like family to me. That's exactly why this is so hard." Matthews knelt down so he could look George in the eye. A gesture that was probably against protocol but felt right in the moment. "You see, I have a daughter who's about your age. Her name is Emma, and she's been sick for a while now. She needs special treatments that cost a lot of money, more than I can afford on my salary here." George's eyes widened with understanding. He had learned about families and responsibilities in his social studies lessons. But this was the first time he was seeing it affect someone he cared about in real life. "I've been offered a job with a private security company," Matthews continued. "It pays much better, enough to help Emma get the treatment she needs. But taking it means I have to leave here. Leave all of you. And that breaks my heart." The guard's voice trembled as he spoke. George could see that this was the most difficult decision Matthews had ever faced. The man was torn between his love for his job and his duty to his daughter. I keep thinking there must be another way, Matthews said, standing up slowly. But I've looked everywhere for extra work, applied for assistance programs, even considered selling my house. Nothing seems to be enough. George felt a strange feeling in his chest, like a balloon expanding and making it hard to breathe. He had never felt so helpless before. Here was someone who had always been there for him, someone who had made his days brighter with stories and kindness. And now that person was suffering. When do you have to decide? George asked, though he wasn't sure why he was asking. By the end of this week, Matthews replied. The other job won't wait much longer, and Emma's next treatment is scheduled for next month. I can't afford to let this opportunity slip away. As Matthews walked away, still clutching the resignation letter, George stood alone in the corridor. The castle suddenly felt much larger and lonelier than it ever had before. The young prince knew he had to do something. But what could someone his age possibly do to help in such a complicated situation? That evening, George lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts and half-formed ideas. He had always been told that with privilege comes responsibility, but he had never faced a situation where that responsibility felt so personal and urgent. He thought about Emma, a girl he had never met but who was somehow depending on decisions being made in his home. He thought about Matthews, who had always treated him with such kindness and respect, and he thought about his own family, wondering if there was something they could do to help. As the night grew darker, George made a decision. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but he knew he couldn't just stand by and watch Matthews leave without trying to help. Tomorrow, he would begin figuring out a way to make things right. The next morning arrived with unusual energy for George. He had barely slept, his mind working through various plans and possibilities. During breakfast with his family, he found himself distracted, pushing his eggs around his plate, while deep in thought. George, you seem quiet this morning, his mother noticed, setting down her cup of tea. Is everything all right? George looked up, considering whether to share his concerns. He had always been taught to think carefully before speaking, especially about matters involving the staff, but this felt too important to keep to himself. Mum, what happens when someone who works here has a family emergency? George asked carefully. Like if they need money for something really important? His mother raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the specificity of the question. Well, there are certain assistance programs available for staff members in genuine need. Why do you ask? Just wondering, George replied, but his mother could tell there was more to it. She had learned to recognize when her eldest child was working through something significant. After breakfast, George decided to conduct what he privately called his investigation. He had learned from watching his parents that good decisions required good information, so he set out to learn everything he could about the situation. His first stop was Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had worked at the castle longer than anyone else. She knew every staff member's story and had a reputation for both discretion and kindness. George found her in the linen room, carefully organizing fresh sheets. Mrs. Henderson, he began politely. May I ask you something? Of course, Your Highness, she replied, pausing her work to give him her full attention. Do you know Officer Matthews, the guard with the brown eyes who works in the East Wing? Mrs. Henderson's expression softened immediately. Oh yes, dear Robert Matthews, lovely man, wonderful father. He's been having such a difficult time lately with his daughter's illness. She shook her head sadly. It breaks my heart to see him struggling so much. He's thinking of leaving, George said quietly. I know. Mrs. Henderson sighed. Word travels fast in a place like this. We're all hoping he'll find another way. But sometimes life doesn't give us the choices we want. George nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Henderson, who decides about the assistance programs my mother mentioned? Well, that would be Mr. Crawford, the head of human resources, in consultation with the senior staff and ultimately your parents, she explained. But George, these things are quite complicated. There are rules and procedures that must be followed. I understand, George said, though he was already forming new ideas. His next stop was less conventional. George made his way to the castle's library, where he spent the afternoon researching everything he could about employee assistance programs, medical fund charities, and staff support systems. He discovered that many large organizations had special funds for exactly the kind of emergency Matthews was facing. The young prince learned that the royal household did indeed have an emergency assistance fund, but it was rarely used and had strict application procedures that could take weeks to process. Matthews didn't have weeks. That evening, George did something he had never done before. He requested a private meeting with Mr. Crawford, the head of human resources. His personal secretary was surprised by the unusual request but arranged the meeting for the following afternoon. Mr. Crawford, a kind but formal man in his 60s, was clearly nervous about meeting privately with the young prince. He sat stiffly in his chair in the small meeting room, unsure what to expect. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Crawford," George began, trying to sound as mature and official as possible. "I wanted to discuss the Emergency Assistance Fund." Crawford's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The Emergency Assistance Fund? Your Highness, that's quite an unusual topic of interest for someone your age." "I've been reading about it," George replied confidently. "I understand that it exists to help staff members during personal crises, particularly medical emergencies." "Number said." George replied. "That's correct," Crawford acknowledged slowly, still puzzled about where this conversation was heading. "I also understand that Officer Robert Matthews has a daughter who requires expensive medical treatment," George continued, watching Crawford's face carefully. Crawford's expression became more serious. "Your Highness, I must ask how you came to know about Officer Matthews's personal situation. Staff privacy is of utmost importance." "Officer Matthews told me himself," George replied honestly. "He's been very upset lately. And when I asked him about it, he explained the situation. He's considering leaving his position here to take a job that pays better." Crawford leaned back in his chair, beginning to understand the purpose of this meeting. "Your Highness, while I appreciate your concern for Officer Matthews, the Assistance Fund has specific criteria and application processes. These matters are quite complex." "What are the criteria?" George asked directly. Crawford explained the various requirements: proof of financial hardship, medical documentation, a formal application process, and approval from multiple levels of management. The process typically took 3 to 4 weeks. "But Officer Matthews needs to make his decision this week," George pointed out. "Is there no way to expedite the process for urgent cases?" "In theory, yes," Crawford admitted reluctantly. "With direct authorization from senior management, emergency disbursements can be made. But such authorization is extremely rare and would require compelling circumstances." George nodded, processing this information. "Mr. Crawford, would it be possible for me to see Officer Matthews' personnel file? I'd like to understand his situation better." Crawford looked uncomfortable. "Your Highness, personnel files are confidential. I really couldn't. As a future member of the family that employs everyone here, wouldn't it be appropriate for me to understand how our staff support systems work?" George interrupted gently, but firmly. It was a sophisticated argument for someone his age, and Crawford found himself reluctantly impressed. After a moment of consideration, he agreed to share general information about Matthew's employment history and performance. What George learned made his determination even stronger. Matthews had been an exemplary employee for 3 years. He had perfect attendance, glowing performance reviews, and had even helped prevent a security incident the previous year when he noticed unusual activity near one of the side entrances. "He sounds like exactly the kind of employee we should want to keep," George observed. Crawford had to agree. "Officer Matthews is indeed one of our most valued security staff members. His potential departure would be a significant loss." As George left the meeting, his mind was spinning with new information and ideas. He had learned that help was theoretically available, but practically out of reach due to bureaucratic procedures. He had also confirmed that Matthews was not just a good person but an excellent employee whose loss would genuinely hurt the organization. That night, George made a decision that surprised even himself. He was going to take his concerns directly to his parents. Not as a child asking for help, but as a young member of the royal family presenting a case for action. He spent hours preparing what he would say, thinking through potential questions and objections. He knew his parents would be surprised by his initiative, but he hoped they would also be proud of his thoughtfulness and determination to help someone in need. The conversation with his parents would either solve Matthew's problem or teach George a valuable lesson about the limitations of good intentions. Either way, he knew he had to try. The following evening, George asked his parents if he could speak with them privately after dinner. His unusual seriousness throughout the meal hadn't gone unnoticed, and both his mother and father could sense that whatever was on their son's mind was important to him. They gathered in the smaller sitting room, away from the formal spaces where official business was conducted. George had chosen this setting carefully, hoping the more intimate atmosphere would help his parents see this as a family conversation rather than a royal procedure. "Mom, Dad," George began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I need to talk to you about Officer Matthews." His parents exchanged glances. They had both noticed George's recent preoccupation but hadn't expected it to center on a staff member. "What about Officer Matthews?" his father asked gently, encouraging George to continue. George took a deep breath and began to tell his parents everything. He explained how he had first noticed Matthew's sadness, their conversation about Emma's illness, and Matthew's agonizing decision between staying at the job he loved and taking a better-paying position to help his daughter. As George spoke, his parents listened with growing attention and respect. They could see that their son wasn't simply reporting gossip or making a casual observation. He had clearly given this matter serious thought and genuine concern. "I've been researching our staff assistance programs," George continued, surprising his parents with his initiative. "I spoke with Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Crawford, and I learned about the emergency fund. The help is there, but Officer Matthews doesn't have time for the normal process." George's mother leaned forward, intrigued. "George, this shows remarkable compassion and initiative on your part. But tell me, why is Officer Matthews' situation particularly important to you?" George considered the question carefully. "Because he's not just doing a job, Mum. He genuinely cares about our family and our home. When I was younger and sometimes felt overwhelmed by all the rules and expectations, Officer Matthews would smile at me in the corridors and tell me stories about the castle. He made me feel like this place was really home, not just a place where I lived." His father nodded slowly. "And you feel we should help him because of his kindness to you?" "Not just that," George replied quickly. "Mr. Crawford showed me his employment records. Officer Matthews is one of the best guards we have. He even stopped a security problem last year. Losing him wouldn't just hurt him and his family, it would hurt us too." George's mother felt a swell of pride in her son's reasoning. He wasn't just thinking emotionally. He was considering the situation from multiple angles, including the practical benefits to the organization. "George," his father said thoughtfully, "if you were in charge of making decisions like this, what would you do?" This was the question George had been preparing for. "I would authorize an emergency disbursement from the assistance fund to cover Emma's treatment costs. It would help Officer Matthews stay in a job he loves and where he's valued. And it would ensure that we keep an excellent employee. It's the right thing to do for everyone involved." The room fell quiet for a moment as George's parents processed what they had just heard. Their 8-year-old son had identified a problem, researched potential solutions, understood the bureaucratic obstacles, and developed a comprehensive argument for action. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this," his mother said finally. "I'm impressed by your thoroughness and your compassion. But most importantly," his father added, "I'm proud that you saw someone in need and felt compelled to help, even though it would have been easier to simply mind your own business." George felt a flutter of hope. "Does that mean you'll help Officer Matthews?" His parents looked at each other, and George could see the silent communication that passed between them. They were making a decision not just about Matthews, but about encouraging their son's developing sense of responsibility and leadership. "George," his mother said, "your father and I will review Officer Matthews' situation and Mr. Crawford's recommendations. If the facts are as you've presented them, and if the assistance fund can cover the necessary expenses, then yes, we will authorize the emergency disbursement." The relief and joy that flooded through George was overwhelming. But his father wasn't finished. However, he continued, this will be done through proper channels, with full documentation and approval processes. We want to help Officer Matthews, but we also want to ensure that we're setting a precedent that's fair to all our staff members. And George, his mother added, we want you to understand something very important. What you've done here, identifying a problem, researching solutions, and advocating for someone in need. This is exactly the kind of leadership we hope to see from you as you grow older. You've shown wisdom, compassion, and initiative. The next morning, George could barely contain his excitement as he waited to hear the results of his parents' review. By afternoon, Mr. Crawford had been authorized to offer Officer Matthews an emergency assistance package that would cover Emma's treatment costs. When Matthews was called to Mr. Crawford's office, he expected the worst. He had been dreading this moment, assuming it would be about his noticeable distraction and declining performance. Instead, Crawford explained that the royal family had authorized emergency assistance for Emma's medical expenses through their staff support fund. Matthews sat in stunned silence, unable to process what he was hearing. But how? He finally managed to ask. I never even applied for assistance. Crawford smiled slightly. Let's just say that your dedication and service have been noticed and appreciated by people who matter. When George encountered Matthews in the corridor later that day, the guard's eyes were red with tears of relief and gratitude. Your Highness, Matthews said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you and your family for this incredible kindness. George felt a warmth spread through his chest unlike anything he had experienced before. Officer Matthews, you don't need to thank anyone. You belong here. And Emma deserves to get better. Sometimes families just take care of each other. Matthews knelt down to George's level, just as he had done a few days earlier when sharing his troubles. You know, Your Highness, I think you're going to make an exceptional leader someday. You have the heart for it. As Matthews continued on his rounds with renewed energy and hope, George stood in the corridor feeling different somehow. He had learned that being in a position of privilege meant more than just enjoying benefits. It meant having the responsibility and opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. 6 months later, George received a hand-drawn card from a little girl named Emma, thanking him for helping her daddy stay at his job so he could take care of her. The card showed a picture of a castle with a smiling guard standing outside and a little prince waving from a window. George kept that card in his desk drawer, a reminder of the day he learned that true leadership isn't about giving orders or having power over others. It's about using whatever influence you have to help those who need it, especially when they can't help themselves. Matthews continued to work at the castle for many years afterward, and though he maintained his professional demeanor, there was always a special warmth in his eyes when he saw Prince George. Both of them knew that they had shared something important, a moment when compassion and action came together to create something good in the world. And George never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most important interventions are the quiet ones, made not for recognition or reward, but simply because they're the right thing to do.